I trust we do, Your Honour. My learned friend has constructed a table or a schedule of documents that I might hand up.
Well, we should probably have it as an exhibit, shouldn't we?
As an exhibit, yes.
Just hand it up and I'll have a look at it.
Mm-hmm.
Your Honour, the document that's about to be handed up, I understand, needs just a little bit of an explanation as we put it together very quickly so as to try to assist.
Oh.
I'm happy to spend 5 minutes with the witness just going through and explaining that document if you'd be assisted.
Why don't you? Thank you.
So these are all separate policies, is that right?
Your Honour, as I understand it, there are 24 policies in the hospital, and underneath those policies there sits procedures.
Right.
So insofar as the document that's just been handed up have numbers 1 to 8, they are probably the most pertinent policies of the 24 relevant to this particular case study. Each of the 24 policies is in a written form where relevant that the policy itself has been produced. For example, you'll see there Code of Conduct, tab 452. Underneath that, with the tabs, they are procedures relevant to the policies, again relevant to this particular case study, and where most of them have been produced. Not all of them, understandably, are in the tender bundle. We've listed the relevant tabs of the ones that are in the tender bundle.
Those that are missing, I think we'll need, not immediately, but we'll need them. So we do have a comprehensive understanding of the situation.
Yes, I can indicate that under 3, the second tab doesn't have a tab number, but it's RMH.001.001.0386. That's one that has been referred to. And then another one under 4 is, it's been referred to as the unaccompanied child procedure. It's also known now as the supervision and movement of inpatients across the Royal Children's Hospital and access to inpatient areas. That number is RMH.1000.004.0029. Those are certainly ones that would need to be tendered, subject to Your Honour's...
What we'll do is we'll do an audit of this when the evidence is finished, and then you'll be told, but I'll get Dr Bennett to tender, without you being here, the documents that complete this package of material.
That would be appropriate, if Your Honour pleases.
Professor, can I just ask you, I assume that there's some formal process within the hospital whereby policies are generated and reviewed, is that?
Correct, yes. The hospital has a policy and procedure committee. It's had for many years. It's chaired by the Executive Director of Medical Services, or the Chief Medical Officer. They meet monthly, and it's supported by the Board Secretary. What the role of that is to approve new policies and procedures, and importantly also to make sure that they are up to date. So all policies and procedures are reviewed at least every 2 years to ensure they're current. And also if there's any change in legislation or government direction or society direction, then we may change them. But it is a very thorough process. They're available on the intranet, and all staff are aware of them.
And I assume that when an event occurs that suggests that there may have been a failure of management or a procedural irregularity, then a review is implemented at that point point in time.
Absolutely.
Irrespective of any
Yeah,
scheduled review.
sure, yes, and there may be a new procedure developed. So, for example, with an incident which is a critical incident in which we do an investigation, what we call a root cause analysis, to find out why it happened and how can we improve, then the outcome of that may or may not be, but often is, a new procedural modification to our procedure to ensure that we improve and don't let that happen again.
If Your Honour pleases, just a couple of more points on that. The procedures, policies and procedures in that document are hospital-wide. So the 24 policies under which those procedures sit are hospital-wide. There are also what are called local areas that relate to particular practice areas. Now, what had been produced with the statement were 4 schedules. Schedule 4, which I understand was the schedule that Your Honour was looking at earlier before the break. I don't know if Your Honour has that in front of you now. It's on the screen, though.
I've got a document that says Schedule 1.
All right. There's a Schedule 1, 2, 3 and a Schedule 4.
I don't know that I have Schedule 4.
Schedule 4 is now on the screen, if that's of some assistance. And I think we might even have a spare copy if it would be convenient for me to have. We probably need a spare 2 copies.
I'm sorry, the document we've got incorporates also Schedule 4.
Yeah. I thank you for that indication. Now, Schedule 4 itself, it has a heading under the number, date, and so forth. It's got RCHM policies. That should probably read RCHM policies and procedures. What I was going to do, if it would be of any assistance, is to ask Professor Kilpatrick to go through that document and just identify in that the local policies that are relevant to particular practice areas. We just didn't have time to do that in a written document.
Say to me again, what you want her to tell us is what?
So that Schedule 4 contains the policies and procedures across the board. Yes. What I have identified in that document I've handed up, they are the hospital-wide policies relevant to this case studies, but there are also a number of local policies and procedures, or procedures probably more so, that are relevant, and they are to do with practice areas. So it's really just to identify some additional ones that aren't hospital-wide, and that can easily be done if you've got that.
Local, what do you mean?
It may be best to get some evidence about this. I can explain it as it's been explained to me, but Professor Kilpatrick is to have some evidence about it. It may be appropriate that she do that in brief compass.
So are you saying that the document we've just been given is not comprehensive?
Correct. What I'm saying is there are 24 policies across the hospital. Of those 24, these are the ones of relevance to this particular case study. But in addition to this document, there are some local procedures and policies that are actually listed in Schedule 4. And I was going to, at this point, ask Professor Kilpatrick to just simply identify them so that you've got a note of what they are. And that would really be just a matter of looking at Schedule 4 and Professor Kilpatrick going through and saying one is a local.
Well, all right. And do we have all the relevant documents?
Yes, these have all been tendered, and the ringtail number is listed
that's fine.
next to each one in Schedule 4.
Well, look, what I'll do is I'll mark the, I'll call it the hospital-wide policy and procedures, or schedule of hospital-wide policy and procedures. I'll make that exhibit 2728, and then and you can help us with the detail. All right?
If Your Honour pleases. When you make that comment, Your Honour, did you want me to briefly take Professor Kilpatrick through this document?
No.
No.
We understand this document, but you tell us that Schedule 4 needs some explaining. Well, I'd like that explained.
Yes, okay, I'll do that now, if I may.
I mean, it may be that when we come to write this report, that there'll need to be discussion between you and Dr. Bennett about some of the content of these documents, but we needn't
Certainly.
delay over them because they'll be fairly self-explanatory, I'd imagine.
Yes, Your Honour. Yeah. Certainly happy to liaise with Council assisting in that regard.
I mean, Professor, what you can see coming is a description of your physical structure and also your policies and procedures with an ultimate recommendation from us that those who haven't got those physical structures do what they can to get them. But secondly, that if we're satisfied that what you've got in place is appropriate, that others should ensure that they have effective policies and procedures and a process of review to try and ensure that best practice is adopted across all Australian children's hospitals. That's what's coming. I make the assumption, as I said earlier, that you will talk to each other in any event about your practices and procedures and your experiences.
Yes.
All right. So where do we go from here, Dr. Bennett?
Well, Your Honour, did you want the particular policies within Schedule 4 to be identified, or are you content for that to be?
I think we should have an understanding, which I gather is going to be given to us through the Professor, of Schedule 4. Is that right?
Yes, I can do that now very quickly with the Professor. Professor, just before I do that, can you just explain, so that we've got some evidence about this, the difference between the hospital-wide policies and procedures compared to the local policies that apply to particular practice areas?
So the hospital-wide policies are clearly the policy statement around high-level areas, and then which are relevant to all staff and volunteers within the Royal Children's Hospital, and the procedures which sit under those put into action the policy elements and implementation of those policy elements, and they're relevant to all staff. The local procedures are relevant often to a technical area, and in some of these Schedule 4, these are what I'd call purely local, very relevant, very important, particularly to the hearing, but are relevant just to one area, and they do not sit on the intranet in the same site as do all policies and procedures for all staff.
Do you have a copy of Schedule 4 in front of you?
Yes, I do.
I wonder if you could go through that document and identify the local policies.
So very quickly, number 1 is a procedure. That is a hospital-wide procedure. Number 2 is the overarching policy of vulnerable children. 3 is a procedure under the policy. 4 is a procedure, hospital-wide. Number 5 is a procedure. Number 6 is terms of reference, which we have on the intranet of a committee which has importance across the whole hospital.
So far you're talking about hospital-wide, are
Correct,
you?
all hospital-wide.
Okay, if you could just make it clear in your answers whether you're talking about hospital-wide or local.
7 is hospital-wide, 8 is hospital-wide, 9 is hospital-wide, 10 is a terms of reference hospital-wide. Number 11 is local. Number 12...
Just stopping there for a moment. Why is number 11 local?
Because, to be honest, it's not on the list When I go to the vulnerable children, I'm just looking at a process issue now. If I look at the vulnerable children's policy and the procedures that are under it, I do not believe this is there. And I think this is more just everything that's in this statement is actually in the procedure, but I think this is specific for staff working in these areas.
I'm not sure I'm understanding. Why wouldn't all staff be or need to be conscious of those guidelines, irrespective of where they're working in the hospital in relation to 11?
To be honest, I can't quite answer that. I think, Your Honour, I'd need to read this to be certain, but I guess I'm coming from the position that I don't recognise this as, I'm sure I've read it, but I don't recognise the title as being under the policy of vulnerable children as being one of those procedures, and which are the hospital-wide, and the most important fundamental one is the one that talks about, which is number 1, which is vulnerable children procedure for suspecting child abuse, and that talks about referring to Gatehouse, talks about referring to Victorian Forensic Medical Service, and talks about the forensic elements as well. So, yes, I'm just.
I wonder
need to look at this to be certain.
whether that particular policy is a clinical practice guideline.
Well, if it's a clinical practice guideline, if I could explain that.
Just the policies are on. Yes, please.
Clinical practice guidelines are developed by the medical staff in particular, but they lead the development of practice guidelines on how staff manage particular medical conditions when they present to a paediatrician, to a doctor, a child with a particular illness. These guidelines are available for staff at the Royal Children's Hospital, but they're actually available to all staff across Australia and, in fact, internationally. They're highly regarded, and there is one that talks about child abuse, and I wonder if it's usually called a clinical practice guideline, so I didn't recognise it in this form. It is available for all staff to read.
And then we go on 12.
Sorry. 12 is the handbook, which again is not listed. It is available through the Victorian Forensic Paediatric Service and through Gatehouse, but it is mainly for their staff. It is not available on the intranet for all hospital staff. Consumer management number 13 is a procedure for all of the hospital. Performance management discipline procedure is a procedure for all of the hospital-wide. 15 is a procedure that is under the vulnerable children's section. Number 16, I believe, is a local procedure. Police requests is a hospital-wide procedure. 18, this is a procedure related, it is a local procedure related to mental health ward and mental health service. Consumer-focused care is a policy of the hospital, hospital-wide. Open disclosure is procedure, hospital-wide. Quality improvement risk management is a policy, hospital-wide. Emergency management is a policy, hospital-wide. And terms of reference for the Policy and Procedure Committee would be on the hospital-wide policies and procedures list. So that is hospital-wide. The following 24 through to down to 39, I believe, are local procedures, and Gatehouse documents 40 through to 48, they're all local procedures.
In developing and reviewing your policies and procedures in the area that we're concerned with, but the question's capable of being understood more generally, but do you, or does the hospital seek help from people outside of the hospital?
Yes, in general, this is a general question.
Yeah.
Yes, we have consumers on many of our committees. In our peak quality committee, we have 2 consumers very actively involved. We meet monthly, and when we're developing procedures and policies for that matter, we believe we need input, and that's common, then yes, they are asked for their assistance. We also have, so the consumers, but also there are a group called the Family Advisory Council, which has been in operation probably for about 7 years, and one of their key roles is to advise us and to make recommendations as to how we can improve the interaction between staff in the hospital and families and children, but also to give us advice about our procedural elements and the wording in procedures as well. And we also have a youth advisory council, which again is obviously young people who also give us similar advice.
But in terms of people with particular qualifications, say in relation to dealing with and managing the risk of sexual assault of children, do you go outside, or does the hospital consider it has sufficient expertise inside?
Well, we do believe that we have very good expertise inside the hospital through the Gatehouse Centre and through the Victorian, which is for Victoria, Forensic Paediatric Medical Service. Those groups are actually engaged by many outside agencies for advice. So we believe that we do have very good expertise within, and very fortunate within our hospital. They are statewide resources.
Yeah, I understand.
Does that complete the Schedule 4? Does that complete Schedule 4?
I'm sorry. Your Honour, could I just make one other comment? I was number 66, the Australian Charter of Healthcare Rights, is an organisational-wide procedure. So, but yes, that completes it.
Schedules 1, 2, 3 and 4 were prepared in response to specific questions asked of you and the Royal Children's Hospital in terms of preparing your statement. Is that right?
Correct.
You've explained Schedule 1. Could you, for the Commissioner's purposes, explain Schedules 1, 2 and 3?
So go through each of these?
Just explain, not so much go through each of them. If you could just perhaps start with Schedule 1.
Schedule 1
what is Schedule 1?
Okay, Schedule 1 is policies where relevant, procedures, hospital-wide or local, or work practices where relevant, with regard to volunteers, in terms of recruitment, screening and assessing their health and mental wellbeing checks. That's what Schedule 1 deals with.
Schedule 2?
Schedule 2 refers to the same material with respect to access to the hospital, including the use of badges and distribution of badges, access passes and registries.
And Schedule 3?
And Schedule 3, again, the same material with respect to supervision management of volunteers.
Thank you.
Professor, have you or the hospital, well, I'll start again. You're, of course, now aware of the detail of the evidence in the case study the Commission's concerned with. I think you've been in the hearing room.
Yes, yes.
Have you or the hospital reflected on whether or not anything you've heard in the case study requires you to reflect upon what your current practices and procedures are?
We've certainly, I was here yesterday and I heard the case study, and we've, myself and my executive colleagues have certainly reflected on elements of this. And so my comments, I'd say, in reflecting on it, is that now in 2015, The approach to quality and safety and risk management is a very strong approach and robust approach. I think I mentioned earlier this morning that it was in 2000, which in some respects is not that long ago, that the Victorian government and all governments had a much more robust approach to quality of care, in particular patient safety in all its forms, and established a governance structure for that, established policy statements about it, and also established the Victorian Quality Council, which was a Victorian Quality Council, which is a group of people who were charged, if you like, to lead the quality agenda across the state. And there have been various iterations and developments since then. So it is a much more robust system of governance in all respects than happened prior to 2000 that we have now in the hospital. And there's no doubt in hospitals today, certainly at the Royal Children's Hospital, that everything we do is always striving with a spirit of improvement. So we're always trying to do better. We learn from our mistakes. We learn from incidents. That's why we have the incident reporting system, why we have we do have a complex committee structure which deals with all of these issues. But I think it'd be fair to say across Australia with the national standards, and certainly across in Victoria and at the hospital I run and manage, that we have a very robust approach, but we can always improve. And we have reflected on that and we will continue to reflect.
Dr. Bennett, do you have any further questions?
Your Honour, I had a number of questions which were designed to elicit much of the material from the policy documents, but given the packaging of the policy documents, to some extent they will speak for themselves. So what I might do is just more narrowly continue my questions with the Professor, and I won't be too long. Mm-hmm. Professor, in the policy documents and the procedures that are now before the Commission, you refer to the issue of conducting an investigation once an allegation of child sexual abuse has been made. And you set out the procedures involved if the complaint relates to an external event, and that is if the child sexual abuse has happened elsewhere. And you've also set out the procedures that will be undertaken if, for example, a staff member or a volunteer has committed the child sexual abuse. Does the policies as they stand now include the possibility that it will be an adult making the complaint about child sexual abuse a number of years earlier?
The procedure doesn't explicitly say that, but what is explicit is that if somebody makes a complaint about something that happened yesterday, this morning, or 20 years ago, it's still taken seriously as a complaint to be investigated. So our complaints management procedure would deal with a complaint at any time.
Right. And so an internal investigation would be conducted in addition to the referral to the police?
Yes.
And what relationship does that process have with what you've referred to as being a critical incident review?
So we would consider today in 2015 an allegation that we'd heard as being absolutely critical. It means it's an incident which is very significant, harm was done, and that we absolutely need to understand how could that have happened and what can we do to improve our systems, processes, policies, procedures, work practices to absolutely ensure that does not happen again. So that it's a terminology we use for an incident which requires a thorough investigation, and we have a procedure which is called the Critical Incident Review, which explains to staff how we would go about that.
And you heard Dr. De Campo's evidence yesterday that in relation to the allegations that were made by AWI, that at that point in time, the hospital did not conduct its own internal investigation.
Yes.
And what you're saying is today such an investigation would be undertaken.
Correct, it would be. And as I said, we have a quality improvement and risk management framework which would dictate that would certainly happen.
Since the time that Dr. De Campo was CEO of the hospital, has any investigation to date been undertaken of the events alleged by AWI taking place in 1981?
No. The hospital, as in myself, I heard about this through the Commission last year.
Right. So do you think at this point in time the hospital's not in a position to have truly reflected on the allegations that were made? No. Without the benefit of an internal investigation?
So I'll rephrase it. So what we have done is clearly we've reflected on it. We've reflected on what we think we believe were the policies, procedures, framework, if you like, that was in existence in 1981, and what is our policies and procedures and work practices in 2015. And in preparing this for the Commission, we have a very thorough understanding of what's in place at the moment, and we have identified some areas where we could improve. I mentioned this morning that the visiting volunteer groups, the training, I was asked about the training for individual volunteers who have a 2.5-day, very thorough training and a good experience for them and for the staff to understand them as potential volunteers. But we don't have quite the same process for the visiting volunteers. So that is reflected, and I'm asking the coordinators of volunteers to consider how could we enhance that training. So yes, we have reflected and see where do we need to improve in our current processes, which we might have thought they were satisfactory. I believe most of them are, but it's a question of how can we do even better when you look at it as a whole in the context of AWI's allegations.
You referred earlier to an open disclosure process, Professor. Can you explain what's involved in that?
So open disclosure there's a procedure about open disclosure. In some form or other, open disclosure has been across Australian hospitals since 2003. We were one of the first countries to introduce it. And it is very robust now. And so what open disclosure means is that when something has happened that should not have happened, whether harm is done or there was a high potential for harm to be done, then we speak in the context of children, often with the family, but the child as well, and explain that we express regret about what has happened. We explain as best we can without having yet done an investigation as to what has happened, what will we be doing to help the child, or young person in this case. And we offer any support we obviously can to the family or the child because this has occurred. And we then assure the family that we will be doing an investigation as to how this happened to occur, and that investigation will inform us did something go wrong, or perhaps it didn't, but we need to find out, and what can we do to improve to prevent this from happening to another child and their family. And we assure the family, as part of the open disclosure, that we would keep them informed of progress of that investigation.
Mm-hmm. And if this policy had been available or in place at the time that the allegations made by AWI were in place, would that open disclosure policy have applied to her?
Yes, it would have. It would have, and it's highly likely the CEO would do that because of the time frame.
Right.
It's usually almost always done in person, but sometimes, for various circumstances, it might be done over the phone. It's usually done in the context of care in the hospital, but sometimes it could be an event some time earlier, and certainly be done ideally face to face.
And typically, does the CEO become involved in that process?
Typically,
yes.
Typically. No. It's usually done by the most senior clinicians. Usually occurs in the clinical field, and it's done by the most senior doctor and nurse involved.
Right, thank you. They are my questions, Your Honour.
Clergy, do you have any questions?
That's okay. Just put those there. Ian Faring, and I appear on behalf of AW1. Doctor, being someone from Melbourne such as yourself, could you just briefly explain the situation with respect to the legal situation of a board such as the Royal Children, which is certainly in my experience significantly different than operate in many other states, in that the board of your hospital and other significant hospitals in Victoria have a corporate existence and a board which is appointed from time to time by the government, but it has its own standing and significant powers which other boards interstate do not have. Is that correct?
That's correct, yes.
You appoint the boards such as yours, or Monash Health or Western Health, which are major multi-campus hospitals, would have a board appointed under the Health Services Act, and clearly they have to coordinate and work with governments and live within their budgets, but the board of a Victorian hospital such as this one has legal existence, control over what occurs within its hospital.
That's correct.
Yes. So, to use perhaps a euphemism, the buck stops with the board in terms of what occurs within that hospital, and clearly the board is significantly dependent upon the CEO to ensure that matters are attended to promptly and adequately.
Correct.
You've given some explanations and they have been very useful, but can you just clarify if AWI was going to and had built up the courage today to make a complaint similar to what she did make in earlier years, where would she find information that would enable her where to go, who to speak to, with respect to making her complaint if she was starting today about something that happened 20 years ago?
So she could ring, options to her, yes. She could ring the hospital. Our switchboard is aware if anyone says they want to make a complaint, they are put through, that person is put through to the Consumer Liaison Officer. That's a staff member we have who receives complaints. Sometimes, and this does happen, they can ring my office directly.
Can I just stop you?
Sorry?
Doctor? With respect, if I looked up the hospital phone number, or AWI yes. looked up the hospital number and rang, you're indicating to the Commission that that person is now well versed and probably well trained in accepting that someone might ring and make an allegation of sexual abuse, and that they would need to respond to that both appropriately and positively.
Correct.
You've heard the evidence in this case, haven't you, that at least on AWI's situation, she made a phone call and she didn't seem to receive such a response.
Correct. I was answering the question in 2015.
Yeah, I understand that. That was my first question.
Sure.
I wasn't attempting to mislead you, but I'm just taking it.
Sure.
Today, the operators on a very busy switchboard, but operators would know that if a telephone call came through, such as AWI's phone call, they would know they have to respond carefully and appropriately to such a serious complaint.
Correct.
And my next question was, if you haven't heard the evidence was that when AWI rang the switchboard, she perhaps didn't get that sort of response.
Absolutely. I have read that, yes.
Yeah. And I take it from your evidence that you would expect and appropriate training is put in place to ensure that that sort of thing would not happen again in 2015.
We would, yes.
Yes. Okay. Can I take? Could the witness be shown document 006, please? You might have seen this, Doctor. If you haven't, please, well,
We better find it first of all before she knows whether she's seen it.
yeah, well,
Are you having trouble finding it?
I'll explain.
Sorry?
Tab 416 might assist. I think you've seen this letter previously.
Yes, I have.
As a result, as I understand, in fact, searches that you put in place. It's a fairly self-explanatory letter, and it relates to the reattendance of Harry into the hospital, at least on one occasion, and misrepresentations made by him to staff to gain access would appear to be a ward, or at least a hospital, but certainly probably a ward as well. Evidence has been given that Mr Brown was at that time a senior officer within the hospital. He was the network executive director, and I understand that made him a deputy director, one of 4 of the most senior officers within the hospital. Do you understand that to be the case?
Yes, I would understand that as an executive director he reported to the CEO, a very senior officer.
Yes. And it would appear from the documents, understanding when this was, that this matter was communicated to him, but no further steps or investigations were carried out after this notification came to a deputy director of the hospital. Would you accept that?
It appears that way, yes, yes.
And again, I'll ask you a question. Should a deputy director, and I assume you have people such as deputy directors or
yes.
within the hospital, should the person in his position within the hospital receive information like this, what would be done in 2015?
Well, if we received this, let's assume this did happen in 2015.
No?
Yes.
Well, that's okay. We'll assume it happened in 2015, but one of the volunteers had come back into the hospital who'd been terminated, to use that expression, and lied to staff saying it's okay, I've been let back in, when clearly that wasn't the situation, and the relevant person whose name's down the bottom, I can't say, I think Ms Watson, I think it is.
Sally.
So she reports to a deputy director that this has occurred. What would happen?
So in 2015, there are a couple of issues. So firstly, that if, let's say Harry was identified in 2015, we'll just assume that way, then he would have been terminated, no question, and he would have been reported to the police and all those things. And we would have, as I mentioned, we would have done an investigation as to how this had happened. There are many different systems in place, so it's difficult to to answer the question in some respects. But
well, I'll break it up
so,
if I can give some assistance.
Well, just so I understand it, what you're saying is there must have been a failure in a system somewhere.
Yes.
That would be investigated today.
That's what so I'm trying to put it in a context that it isn't, but put it in the context that we would have done an investigation as to how Harry, who would have in 2015 would have had a working with children check, would have had a police check, would have been through a 2.5-day training program that we've spoken about, would have had a lanyard on, would have been well known about when he goes to the ward and when he doesn't go to the ward. So how this could come about. And so we would definitely put in an investigation as to how this could have happened. The second point is that, which I made this morning, is that the auxiliaries are not run by the hospital. They are run by the foundation, the Royal Children's Hospital Foundation. They do not have access to the wards or the clinical areas, today you wouldn't have an auxiliary worker able to have access.
Okay, well, I'll make it easy for you then.
Okay.
Doctor. Someone who was in 2014 a volunteer, they are terminated as Harry was terminated. Yes. Let's say we terminated them on the 1st of July last year for the same allegation that was made against Harry. And then 12 months later, in March of 2015, not quite this report, but a report comes to a senior officer within the hospital that the volunteer who has been terminated for an allegation of sexual abuse 12 months ago is back in the hospital. What would be done?
The executive would definitely report this to me, and we would immediately ensure that this person is not here anymore, and we would investigate how this has happened.
And would this matter have been the one I've just described to you, where someone has come back, misrepresented their situation, would that have been reported to the police, or would it be reported to the police today?
I believe we have already reported this person to the police. We report the person to the police again, yes.
Well, it's simple. That is, would you do it again, having terminated him and reported him to police, in my example, in 2014, when he attempts to, if you like, gain access to children again in 2015, would you report him again?
Yes.
Right. And the purpose of that, Doctor, that is the referral of this sort of behaviour, that is such as a volunteer who's breached the rules, an allegation of sexual abuse has been made, and then they try and re-enter a children's hospital. The purpose of that is to ensure that any criminal activities that person might be involved in or might have been involved in is dealt with by the police. Correct?
Yes.
And that is the appropriate step where any allegation arises in relation to criminal behaviour by a volunteer.
Yes.
The police should be involved.
Police should be involved,
yes,
and the hospital needs to understand how this could have happened as well, so that we can improve.
Yes, and where, if you like, having reported at once that the person might be an inappropriate person and might have been involved in criminal behaviour, and they attempt to re-enter the hospital, that is certainly a matter that should go to the police.
Yes.
Because they might be what would otherwise be described as a serial offender. Correct?
Correct.
Yes. And they might, leaving aside the particular child they have access to on this day, or whichever day, they might be engaged in criminal behaviour involving other children.
Correct.
And they might be involved in other institutions who don't know what's happened at the Royal Children's Hospital. Because they might volunteer in more than one establishment.
Correct.
Right. And that's the sort of thing the police are going to find out about. Because they will go looking, won't they?
Yes.
And so do you see that reporting of potential criminal behaviour to the police as a very important obligation the hospital has?
Absolutely.
Leaving aside the law.
Absolutely. Protecting children and young people is what we must do.
Right. And one would have expected that attitude be one that the Royal Children's Hospital's had for a very, very long time, wouldn't it?
You would expect that.
Yes. If I went onto the hospital's internet site, would I find information, because that's what a lot of people would do in 2015, would I find anything that would indicate a particular person I should contact if I wish to make a complaint about past sexual abuse that had occurred within the hospital?
To be perfectly honest, I don't. I must be honest, obviously. I don't know that. I know in the internet, it guides consumers and people and families as to how they can make a complaint to the hospital through the consumer liaison officer that I mentioned earlier. It does guide them to that. There's my email address is on the internet site.
Is that internet or intranet?
No, internet.
Thank you. And
people do send me emails of concern or otherwise. I'm not sure if the Gatehouse Centre has, I'm sure, an internet site, and whether it says how you could. I assume it does say, but I don't know. What you're asking specifically is someone who has had an experience of child sex abuse years ago. How would they go about it? I do not believe there's anything specific about that.
Because if you go through the policies that are now voluminous, and I might have missed something, and I'm happy for it to be corrected, but if you go through the policies, there is a very heavy emphasis, and I can understand why this is the case, very heavy emphasis on, first of all, the external complaints, because that's a significant, as you've indicated, role of the hospital to look for such things where children have been abused in the community and come into the hospital. And there's then, if you like, an emphasis on if there is abuse of a child in the hospital. But there doesn't appear to be much reference, if any emphasis at all, upon someone who has left the hospital and is now an adult and might have come to the realisation they should do something about what did happen to them perhaps a long time ago.
I agree that's not been spelled out, but under internal complaint, in the light of the case study that we had heard about, then clearly that was the process that we would implement it. In other words, we'd consider that an internal complaint.
The hospital probably would do that if we read the material. But if I was someone who was distressed, a member of the public, not perhaps with the access and experience that some people have, it would appear to me, and if I'm wrong, please say so, that might be something they would find very difficult to find or appreciate.
Okay. In the light of the Royal Commission, we have certainly put in place ways in which to ensure people who wish to come forward and speak about past experience that they feel comfortable and will be respected, and this will be taken seriously. And there have been a number of initiatives. That's more recently only.
Okay, the Commissioner might have asked you this. What would you say of, in the light of perhaps information in the last 6 or 12 months, steps that have been taken to try and facilitate a complaint from an adult about past experiences at the hospital? I think make it easier for them to come forward.
Yes. As I said before, we have ensured that our complaints manager liaison officer is very aware and astute to this possibly coming forward, and we have ensured that switchboard is very aware of that. More recently, we have ensured that the main, what we call a main reception desk in Main Street of the hospital, where people, it's a first port of call, if you like, contact, that they are very aware this may happen, and to make people feel comfortable and to understand their sensitivities and to ensure that they feel that their concerns are being taken very seriously. And we've also alerted staff around the hospital to make sure that if they hear anything, that they clearly report that on through the right channels.
You indicated that the hospital, given its function in Victoria as a effectively collecting agency, because doctors and many others will refer to the hospital if there is a concern about sexual abuse, that there were significant numbers, hundreds if not perhaps 1,000 referrals of outside external allegations, to use that expression. How many complaints have there been about internal difficulties?
I've been at the hospital. I've been at the hospital since August 2008, and there have been two allegations of child sex abuse of current patients whilst in the hospital.
So both the ones that have occurred in your tenure have both been internal in the real sense, that is, they happened while the child was there and a complaint was made and it was processed. But you have not had, this is a question, anyone come, if you like, back to the hospital and say, 10 years ago I was treated inappropriately in the hospital.
Apart from the case study, obviously.
Yes.
No.
Were they allegations of abuse committed by a member of staff or a volunteer or by a visitor?
Member of staff.
Member of staff. And do you know the outcome? Was there criminal proceedings?
I know the outcome. Both reported to the police, and both went through the what we have already talked about, investigation and open disclosure and referral to Gatehouse and VFPMS, and there have been no criminal recorded. No.
So the police didn't bring a prosecution?
No.
Doctor, you've described in glowing terms, and one can understand why you might have that glowing attitude to the new building and the obvious improvements within the facility that you now occupy. I want you to take your mind back to, I think you have some understanding of what the old hospital looked like and how it operated in the broad sense, even though you weren't there in 1981.
No.
Take your mind back to say, and if you feel you're able to comment on whether or not within the hospital in those times it would have been appropriate to allow a volunteer to spend half an hour or at least a significant period of time alone with a young child in a closed room away from the ward.
Today, no. Not appropriate.
Certainly, I think you've made it clear that, in one sense, physically it couldn't even happen today because of the building to a significant extent, but even leaving that aside, it would not be permitted today anywhere in the hospital. Today.
Let me, first of all, the physical, we'll use the playroom as the space. So the playroom is extremely visible. There are at times volunteers in the playroom with children. There are at times parents with children, and there are play therapists with children, and there are siblings with children. So it's extremely visible. The vast majority of volunteers, 90%, are female. I'll just make that comment. And so there would be times when there would be a child, a young child, and a volunteer, a female volunteer, in the playroom.
My fault. I'll split it up. I was asking you a question about whether you felt you could, if you can't, please say so, comment on the situation in the old hospital in 1980, thereabouts, whether or not it would have been appropriate, leaving aside the physical structure of the old hospital, for a volunteer to spend upwards of half an hour alone with a young child away from the ward. You know the factual circumstances.
It's inappropriate.
Yeah, and it was inappropriate then. That's really my question.
Yes, it was inappropriate.
Yes. And it wouldn't happen now, partly because the physical structure of the hospital is very different.
And the many checks and balances we have in place, and attitudes and awareness.
Yeah. And you've just answered my question, but I'll ask you again just for the sake of... in 2015, it would not be countenanced for that sort of situation to occur anywhere in the hospital.
No.
And if a volunteer said, I'm going to take Johnny or Jill, whichever it might be, and I've asked their parents, I'm going to take them down to McDonald's, which is still within the hospital, and we'll be gone for an hour and come back, that wouldn't be allowed.
No, that could, McDonald's no, but sometimes we see, particularly young children, you'll see a volunteer pushing a pusher around with a child. They tend to remain just in the area which is adjacent to their ward, but this would be with the parents' permission. There is closed-circuit television cameras everywhere in our hospital, and so if there's ever an issue, we review those, and that has happened. In other words, there's a high awareness of appropriateness, and so the answer is yes, that could happen. A volunteer could take the child away with the parents' permission, but a volunteer who is trained very much in the issues of professional boundaries, of appropriateness, and all the training that we've outlined this morning.
Thank you for that, but I'll just make my question a little clearer.
Sorry.
There would still be some locations within the hospital where there are not closed-circuit television, there's not open windows, where a person could take a child and not be subject to observation. If that occurred, that would be inappropriate. That is my question.
Absolutely inappropriate.
Yes. And if it came to the attention of a ward charge nurse or a ward assistant that a volunteer, and my question goes further, even if the parent had agreed, because the parent would probably be very trusting of most volunteers, they're in your hospital, they've been screened, they think these are very decent people. They might well agree, yes, you can take Johnny for a walk, I just used McDonald's as an example. They might well agree this will be okay, but if it came to the attention of staff that the child and the volunteer had spent time in a closed room not being capable of observation for more than a minute or two or something, but for half an hour, that would be inappropriate behaviour and would be the subject of an investigation.
That would be reported, subject to investigation, and regardless, the volunteer would be counselled and likely be terminated.
Thank you. I have no further questions. Thank you.
Just a few very brief questions, but I'll certainly finish by one if that's of assistance. Professor Kilpatrick, you gave some evidence about the difference between volunteers and auxiliaries. You remember that?
Yes.
Now, I just want to expand on that a little. His Honour asked you a question about a volunteer coming into the hospital wearing a lanyard, and to all those observing, this seemed to be okay, that it was appropriate that the volunteer wearing the lanyard be there, but the volunteer was not rostered on duty. If you remember those questions. If I could just extend that scenario, I suppose, more to the scenario that happened with Harry returning as an auxiliary member. Okay, so keeping that in mind. First of all, does an auxiliary member wear a lanyard?
Yes, they do have a lanyard which says auxiliaries. It's a red, purpley colour. It says auxiliaries.
And is it clearly distinguishable from the lanyard that the volunteers?
Yeah, totally. Different words, different colour.
In terms of access to the hospital, if an auxiliary is wearing, or somebody is wearing a lanyard with auxiliary on it, where are they allowed to be in the hospital?
Well, they are only allowed in the public areas, the same as anyone who comes off the street. So essentially that's Main Street. They could wander into the outpatient area, but the answer is no different to the public.
Right. So an auxiliary wearing a lanyard doesn't signify to certainly staff that they are entitled to be anywhere in the hospital over and above
definitely
the
not.
public.
The wearing of a lanyard is recognition of these people who spend many, many hours working, raising money for the benefit of the hospital. It's a recognition, but it doesn't give them any access to the hospital. The badge gives them no access. The badge is just an identity.
All right. Now, you've also spoken about the system of governance of auxiliaries now.
Yes.
Can you just explain to the commissioners when that system, as it exists now, came into play and what the relevant differences are between in your time introducing the new, or being part of the introduction of the new system, and before that?
So when I came to the hospital, the auxiliaries were part of the hospital, as we'd previously heard. It seemed to me that they were community fundraisers doing wonderful work, but the core work was fundraising, and so it would be more appropriate if they were recruited and managed and governed by the Royal Children's Hospital Foundation, which, as I said, is a separate legal entity. So about 2009, I believe, they were changed to that arrangement, which has worked very well. There have been various improvements and changes over the years, but now there's a record of all auxiliary groups and all auxiliary members. There is a database with all their names, and they all have working with children checks and police checks, even though they rarely come to the hospital, but nonetheless they do. We insist on that. They sign an agreement to be an auxiliary about how they will raise money to make sure that's done appropriately. I think that's all.
Thank you. What about in terms of any auxiliary members that come to the hospital? Is there a roster that applies to them in the way that you've talked about a roster applying to the volunteers?
So it's, yes, there is a roster in the sense of a roster for each auxiliary group to come to the hospital, able to set up their stall, we'll call it. It's in a special place, which is called auxiliaries area. They set up their stalls there, and they would have a roster that they can be there that particular Monday or Tuesday or whatever date it is, and they can't be at any other time, and they'll come. And the auxiliary coordinator, which is part of the Royal Children's Hospital Foundation, would supervise the running of those stalls. So there is a roster, definitely.
Thank you. You've spoken a lot about the current layout of the hospital. And certainly you've explained the visibility side of things very well. Just in terms of the wards, from the statement of AWI, it seems that she was in certainly at many times, in a ward with a large number of other patients. Could that happen now?
No. We have 85% of our wards are single rooms. There's a bed for, obviously, the child, patient, and there's a bed for a parent, and the parent is there each night with them. Apart from that, there are some double rooms, and there's only one single area down near the emergency department which would have 4 beds in one area, which is for acute care and short stay.
Parents are obviously entitled to visit their own children.
There's no such thing as visiting hours for parents.
And there would be from time to time others that come to visit children.
Yes.
What is there in place to prevent, for example, one person coming to visit child A that they have some connection with going into a room of another child? When the parents, I'll answer this way, when the parents come into a ward, they're admitted to the ward with their child, the nurse unit manager and the associate nurse unit manager and the nurse involved in that particular care would be very involved with the parents. They would talk to the parents about who are the legal guardians, because that sometimes can be complex, and who can visit and who can't from their point of view. They would also instruct the parents that encourage them no end to stay with their child 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, and to let them know when they're not, and they can't for some reason or other. It's usually a short period of time. And they would also be instructed not to go into another person's room, never go into another patient's room, and they would also ask them if there are any people they thought were not suitable to be visiting them. Thank you. And then just finally, you've given some evidence about what's on the internet in terms of making complaints and so forth. Parents and patients given any consumer information about these types of matters when they first arrive at the hospital?
Yes. So when parents come in, as mentioned, there's information. They get a pack which has a lot of information about the hospital, what's available, resources, that sort of thing. But they're also given a document, which is a Charter of Rights and Responsibilities, which has been modified to be suitable for children and young people. They are given that, and very importantly, they're also given from day one, if they have a concern, a complaint, how to make that complaint and to raise concerns.
Thank you. No further questions.
Yes, Dr. Bennett.
Nothing further here.
Thank you, Professor. Thank you for your evidence. You are now excused.
Before, Your Honour, just before I leave, could I make a brief comment to AWI, please?
Yes.
I'm not sure if she's listening, but if she is, I'd just like to say that I heard your story, a very distressing story yesterday, and I just want to emphasise I heard you. It was distressing to hear, but I definitely heard you. On behalf of the Royal Children's Hospital, I sincerely apologise for the suffering that you experienced whilst you're a patient in our hospital under our care. There is no doubt we failed you, and for that I am sorry. Thank you for listening.
Yes, thank you. Yes, Dr. Bennett.
Your Honour, there are no further witnesses for today, and that completes the part 3 of the case study. The next witnesses are the final witnesses from part 1 of the case study, which are the former commissioners from the Healthcare Complaints Commission at 10 a.m. on Friday morning.
Yes, thank you. Ms Judd, as I said earlier, we will want to make sure that we do understand all of the policies and practices that are relevant. I'll have Dr. Bennett's people prepare a single document, which then highlights the portions that are relevant to this case study, but I'd like you and your people to check it so that we do truly have a proper, comprehensive understanding of the policies and practices that apply.
We're certainly very happy to assist in that regard and in any other way, Your Honour.
Yes, thank you. Very well. We'll adjourn until Friday at 10.